Good morning and welcome. I'm Kenneth Marcus, the chairman and founder of the Louis D. Brandeis Center, and I want to welcome all of you to the second of our congressional briefings. This comes at a very emotional and difficult time, just a matter of weeks after the October 7 Hamas atrocities, some of the worst attacks that the Jewish community has seen. Forgive me, I'm going to give a few details, and I apologize that we're eating. But what we saw was not only a mass murder of both Jewish Americans and others who were in Israel, but also sexual assaults, torture, decapitation, acts of a gruesome nature that I will not detail, but some of the most horrific attacks that I had heard of, certainly within the last half century. From an American point of view, as horrifying as the incidents in Israel has been the response by many on college campuses. Immediately after the atrocities and even before Israel really had swung into action, we saw on many college campuses immediate and passionate support for the perpetrators by numerous groups and individuals who have in a very public way aligned themselves with Hamas, a terrorist organization, and who have in a variety of ways harassed and attacked Jewish students on college campuses around the country. In some cases, physical assaults, in some cases, vandalism, in some cases, other forms of harassment. For the Jewish community, this came even at a time when we were seeing already historic levels of anti-Semitism around the world, in the United States, and especially on college campuses. And yet, since October 7, based both on data, for example, from the Anti-Defamation League and also from other organizations around the world, we're seeing things that we hadn't seen in decades. And from our own experience at the Louis D. Brandeis Center, we are getting every day an onslaught of reports and basically pain from Jewish college students, parents, and faculty like we've never seen before. Even before October 7, I would say that what we had seen was unprecedented, but we have seen an exponential rise in this problem since then. Truly, it is the worst that we have ever seen. Fortunately, there are various ways in which we are fighting back. At the Louis D. Brandeis Center, we are working with Jewish college students around the country on how they can make their voices heard, and where it's more a matter of taking action, supporting them in potential legal claims. I have here also some colleagues at other organizations who are doing other important work, and I know that many of you are in offices that are taking leadership to deal with this problem. We at the Louis D. Brandeis Center do not endorse or lobby for particular bills or legislative activity. Nothing construed nothing said today should be construed as an endorsement for the Brandeis Center of any legislation or candidate. I can't help but mention that yesterday there was an anti-Semitism awareness bill that was introduced. I was thrilled that Congressman Lawler was able to assemble a bipartisan group of, I think it's now up to 5 Democratic and 5 Republican co-sponsors of that bill. I would say that the notion at the center of this bill is one that we have advocated for many years. The central recommendation of my 2015 book on the definition of anti-Semitism is that the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights needs to have a definition of anti-Semitism, and it needs to be the one that has been adopted throughout the world. IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. This is also the core provision of the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, just as it was the core provision of the executive order on combating anti-Semitism, Executive Order 13899. The last administration promised that it would issue a regulation that would codify Executive Order 13899 on combating anti-Semitism and make sure that OCR would always have this definition of anti-Semitism to use, but the clock ran out before that work was done. This administration, to its credit, promised that it would issue that regulation, but it promised it by a date certain, and that date came and went, and it postponed, and it postponed, and it postponed again. The current deadline offered from this administration in the OIRA notice is December of this year, December 2023. And yet we've heard nothing from the administration publicly about it, even at a time when campus anti-Semitism is through the roof. There are lots of different questions of what can be done, what should be done, and what I'm just going to say now is that you could not hear from a better group of experts on how to address that. I'm not going to introduce my dear friends and colleagues over here. With the one exception, I will introduce our distinguished moderator, who can introduce the others. My colleague and friend Alyza Lewin is the president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. She is one of the people talking to more college students than you could possibly imagine, as well as speaking out in a variety of fora, and one of the most prominent lawyers in the Jewish community. A founding partner of the law firm of Lewin and Lewin. She is also a former president of the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, but most importantly, I'm proud to be able to say she is my colleague at the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, and I'm pleased to welcome Alyza Lewin.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken, and thank you all for coming here today. I am going to introduce our speakers. What I'll do is I'll introduce all three of them, and then we'll hear from each one. So our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Mark Goldfeder. So Mark is the director of the National Jewish Advocacy Center, and the breadth and extent of his work in this area of countering and combating anti-Semitism is truly remarkable. From his cases to his articles to his classes, he's everywhere, advocating as the National Jewish Advocacy Center on behalf of and providing legal assistance to the American Jewish community. So he's handled cases involving anti-Semitism around the country. He's worked with local, state, and federal legislators on measures to support the Jewish community. He's also defended students and professors and businesses and nonprofits which have been targeted for their support of the Jewish state of Israel. He's worked on cases at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and he has successfully represented clients including American and Israeli nonprofits in federal litigation. Mark has also taught at a whole slew of law schools around the country and around the world. To name a few, he's been a senior lecturer at Emory University School of Law, but he's also been a visiting professor at Georgia State University School of Law, at Florida Southern College, in Italy at the University of Padua, at another university, which I'm going to mispronounce if I try and pronounce the name, Scuola Galileana, and IDC's Radnor Law School, and as well as Bar-Ilan Law School. And his work focuses on law and religion, constitutional law, international law, and he publishes widely in both law journals as well as in more popular publications like CNN, The Wall Street Journal, The Hill, Forbes, and other major publications. He's also the co-author of a 5-volume treatise on religious organizations and the law, and he has served as the founding editor of the Cambridge University Press Series on Law and Judaism. And he currently serves by presidential appointment as the member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Council. And our second speaker is going to be Carly Gammill. Carly is the founding director of the StandWithUs Center for Combating Antisemitism, and she also serves as counsel for litigation strategy in the StandWithUs legal department. We work at the Brandeis Center very closely with StandWithUs. They are out there on the front lines working with students on campuses from the K through 12 level to the university level, educating, training, providing the support and the assistance and the legal guidance to students on campuses. So Carly is a constitutional litigator with extensive experience in assisting clients on a wide range of issues, including freedom of speech and religious liberty. She's been working in this area for over a decade, fighting anti-Semitism on campuses, in local communities, in court, and in the United Nations. She has an absolute passion for this issue and cause, and she brings to bear a background in education and a deep personal conviction that the world, including people of all races and religions, cannot afford to stand by silently while the Jewish people are once again targeted, marginalized, demonized, and harmed. And so to that end, Carly works regularly with students, professors, and members of the broader community to inform them about their legal rights and to support them so that they're best positioned to protect those rights. And our third speaker is going to be Rabbi Fusfield, who has served as the Deputy Director of the Neighborhood International Center for Human Rights and Public Policy since 2007, and as the Director of Legislative Affairs for B'nai B'rith International since 2003. He's responsible for B'nai B'rith's policy, advocacy, and government relations, including formulating and promoting B'nai B'rith's agenda on Capitol Hill and representing the agency before Congress, the executive branch, foreign governments, and international organizations. In 2022, Rabbi Fusfield was appointed by the governor of Virginia to serve on the Virginia Commission to Combat Antisemitism. He's both an attorney and a rabbi, and he previously served on the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Faith-Based Security and Communications Advisory Committee. In 2008, Eric helped secure the passage of IHRA 185, which was legislation that for the first time urged the U.S. administration to prioritize in all international deliberations over the Middle East the plight of the nearly 1 million Jewish refugees from Arab and Muslim countries. And the following year, in 2009, he actually authored SR 111, the first ever acknowledgement by the U.S. government of the country's failure to rescue 937 passengers aboard the MS St. Louis as they attempted to flee Nazi persecution in 1939. We're here, as Ken said, because we find ourselves in a situation today where there are actually on campuses across the country and beyond campuses individuals who are rationalizing and justifying Hamas's brutal murder of Jews and insisting that those barbaric acts were not actually anti-Semitic, but that were somehow rationalized or justified. That can only happen if we don't have a clear definition of anti-Semitism. And so one of the things we're going to be talking about today is why it's so important for everyone to be able to have a consensus agreement about what anti-Semitism is and how it manifests today. So with that, I'm going to invite Mark to come up and give us a basic general understanding of the definition of anti-Semitism and how it's been applied in law.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
I want to talk briefly about two of the most common types of anti-Semitism cases that we're seeing across the country. And the first is on-campus harassment of Jewish students. The second is hate crimes or acts of unlawful discrimination that are committed against Jewish people. You probably already know that on university campuses across the country, anti-Semitism has become entrenched and systemic and broad and deep, with recent studies showing that about 75% of Jewish students on campus have reported feeling unsafe because of their Jewish identity. And it's not just in college. More and more frequently, we are seeing people in the K through 12, middle school, even elementary school kids who are being harassed and targeted for being Jewish. I want to give you a concrete example to show what this looks like. Last year, the Georgia legislature tried to pass a bill defining anti-Semitism. We heard testimony from a young boy named Aaron. Aaron and his twin brother were special needs students, and they were in public school in Fulton County. And for 18 months, they were harassed and demeaned and physically hurt. People would shove them into lockers. They would throw coins at them, yelling anti-Semitic slurs. And that's aside from the swastikas on bathroom walls and the graffiti which said death to the Jews and gassed those Jews. Anyway, in Aaron's case, as is typical, the school did nothing. In fact, they gaslighted him and told him that he was wrong. Those weren't swastikas, those were just Hindu symbols. And that the graffiti which said kill the Jews, that's just kids being kids. And coins being thrown at them, those are just pranks, not anti-Semitism. It got so bad that Aaron contemplated suicide. Thankfully, his mother, Beth, caught him in time and got him the help he needed, and she pulled both of her kids out of the school. The federal government had to step in and get involved and threaten both the accreditation and the funding of the entire county. Eventually, they cleaned up. It was a mess, but in some ways, it was also a very interesting model. So let me take a step back and explain. In the United States, Title VI of the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964 requires recipients of federal funding, including most schools, to ensure that their programs and activities are free from harassment, intimidation, and discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin. If you notice, religion is not on that list, and that's because people were concerned about separation of church and state, a variety of reasons, but regardless, the Civil Rights Act does not give the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, or OCR, jurisdiction to investigate anti-religious bias. So for a very long time, until 2004, OCR typically did not take investigation about anti-Semitism on the grounds that Jews are a religious group and not a race or a type of national origin. And for years, Jewish students had little to no protection on campus. And then in a September 2004 Dear Colleague letter, the then Deputy Assistant Secretary of Education, Kenneth issued a series of policy statements announcing that moving forward, OCR would in fact investigate anti-Semitism complaints to the extent that they implicated ethnic or ancestral bias. And again, the logic behind that is incredibly clear, right? Much of the hatred embodied in anti-Semitism has nothing to do with specific religious practices. Very few people are discriminated against because they do or do not light Shabbat candles on a Friday night. Most of the time, it's about a real or perceived race, ethnicity, or national origin. And so this became OCR policy, and as of just a few weeks ago, the Biden administration announced that 8 more federal agencies were adopting what's now known as the Marcus Doctrine. And so, yes, in theory, Jews should be protected from anti-Semitism as long as it is not based on this or that religious practice, which it very rarely is. But the important thing to remember is that even under Title VI, not all forms of harassing behavior are illegal. So for example, typical school bullying behavior does not violate Title VI as long as it's not based on race, ethnicity, or national origin. So for example, if you bully someone based on their political beliefs or their affiliations, it may be wrong, but it's not unlawful under Title VI. It's only illegal if it's motivated by unlawful discriminatory intent. And so one problem actually still remained for OCR even after the Marcus Doctrine, which was this. Because Jewish identity is so incredibly multifaceted, right? It includes aspects of race, religion, culture, ethnicity, and national origin. It was way too easy for people to do anti-Semitic things and then claim it wasn't anti-Semitism because it wasn't based on this or that particular characteristic. For example, people would discriminate and attack Jews because they hate Israel. They'd say that's not anti-Semitism, that's just political. So that's why Executive Order 13899 codified the now long-standing OCR policy that A, for the purposes of Title VI discrimination claims, Jewish students are protected, and it also confirmed something new, that when you're evaluating those claims, the department should consider the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism. Is anyone familiar with the definition? I'll give just a very brief background then. The IHRA is an intergovernmental organization that focuses mostly on Holocaust-related issues. In the early 2000s, they saw that anti-Semitism was already on the rise again, and they decided that never again means addressing anti-Semitism now, before there's a massacre. You can't fight something that you can't define, so they set about developing a definition of anti-Semitism. They had experts working on it for years. They first published it in 2005. It was endorsed as a guide by the US State Department as early as 2007, unofficially adopted in 2010, and in 2016, after it was formally adopted by a plenary of the then 31 countries in the IHRA, which includes the United States, our State Department formally adopted it. So since then, it's been adopted by dozens of other countries, the whole EU, over 1,100 entities altogether, including 31 states in this country. But again, relevant to this part of our discussion, in 2019, the Department of Education formally adopted it as part of the executive order. So what is the IHRA definition, and what does it do different than other definitions? And I'll start with an observation from the late Chief Rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacks. He believed that in terms of its focus, anti-Semitism often looks at Jews as a collective. The idea being that individual Jews might be tolerable, but Jews as a separate collective identity should not be allowed to exist with the same rights as other groups. And that's why the majority of anti-Semitism in any given historical era tends to focus on the primary form of collective Jewish identity at that time. So throughout the Middle Ages, Jews were for the most part a religious community, and they were hated for their religion, even if the particular Jews who were being oppressed were not particularly religious. In the 19th and 20th centuries, many Jews became secularized, so the primary unifying collective identity of Jews was their ethnicity. So the hatred mutated to focus on race, even when the Jews being oppressed only had a trace amount of Jewish blood in them. Think about the Nazi Nuremberg race laws. And today, when the primary collective embodiment of Jewish people on the world stage is the people of Israel in their nation state, Jews around the world are attacked and oppressed and held accountable for their state, even if they're not Israeli. So the practical problem of defining anti-Semitism is that it is a mutating virus, right? Jews are criticized for being whatever a society or a particular part of society doesn't like at that particular moment. So at the same day in the news, you will see people on the right calling them radicals and the left calling them fundamentalists. Jews are simultaneously, they're too liberal and too conservative, they're too rich and a drain on society. A definition of anti-Semitism that can encompass all of these different possibilities and more needs to be able to cut through any timely rationales that are given for this timeless hatred. Because if you don't, anti-Semites will just find another rationale and another reason for why this hatred is justified. So what you need is a praxeological or a conduct-based definition. The definition that does this is the IHRA definition, precisely because it gives examples that focus on the manifestations of anti-Semitism, meaning what anti-Semites do as opposed to why they do it. That's what makes IHRA such a good and important definition. So what IHRA did in the executive order was it filled a gap, which is to say that when Jewish students complain this was anti-Semitism, and the school says, no, it's not anti-Semitism, it's just X, Y, or Z, often politics, now there's a standard to look at and see if contextually that does look like anti-Semitism. It gives OCR an objective definition to use as a guidepost so that authorities don't miss anti-Semitism that's hiding behind something else like anti-Zionism. Now again, to be very clear, the executive order and the model, the bill that just dropped yesterday, they don't limit anti-Semitic speech. There's no hate speech exception. People can say whatever they want, however important, about Jewish people or the Jewish state. They just can't act on that and harass or attack people. Right? Harassment, even verbal harassment, is a form of conduct, not speech. And unlike speech, discriminatory conduct can and should be regulated. So the federal government, at least, is clear that Title VI does include most forms of anti-Semitism, and when they're trying to decide a pattern of conduct, they have an objective standard to compare it with. And it's become a very important tool in the toolbox for dealing with anti-Semitism on campus. But what about, very quickly, off campus? What about hate crimes or other unlawful acts of discrimination, like hiring or firing or housing discrimination? You might think, well, I get why anti-Semitic discrimination is a problem on campus because they're governed by Title VI, and it doesn't say religion, and there's a question of whether Jews are included, but why would they not be included in things like hate crimes? So there's a charitable answer, and there's a not-so-charitable answer, okay? Let me share with you a quick statistic. A recent survey found, I mentioned that about half of adults don't know what anti-Semitism means, but there's another survey done by the ADL, and it used 11 anti-Jewish tropes, and they asked people if they were true, okay? 85% of Americans believe at least one anti-Semitic trope. 20% of Americans, about 52 million people, believe 6 or more of the 11 anti-Jewish tropes. 3% of the population, about 8 million people, believe every single one of the 11 anti-Semitic tropes. 8 million people is more than the entire number of Jews in the United States. Okay, so the charitable answer is that people really don't know. The uncharitable answer is that people actually believe in the anti-Semitic tropes, which is why education is so incredibly important. But you need to give people a definition to use because otherwise you might miss them. Remember I told you in the beginning about Fulton County and how they said the swastikas are just peace symbols? It happens in this context too. A couple of months ago, a judge in San Francisco dropped hate crime charges against a man who walked into a synagogue near his house and started firing blanks at a group of elderly Jewish people who had gathered for a Torah study session. The man had a documented history of posting anti-Semitic propaganda and slurs, including photos of himself dressed as a Nazi soldier and pictures of that very same synagogue set on fire. But because there's no legal standard to point to, the judge found, and there was, I quote, no substantial evidence of bias against the Jewish community, and they dropped the hate crime charges. It's usually not about swastikas, it's usually about Israel. I'm going to end in 1 second, but I used to tell the story about this synagogue in Wuppertal, Germany. It was destroyed during the Holocaust, rebuilt in 2002, and in 2017, a group of German Palestinian men firebombed the synagogue. Okay? When they got to court, they told the judge, bombing the synagogue in Germany was not anti-Semitic. It was their way of expressing their political disagreement with the state of Israel. And the judge said, yeah, that makes sense. And the appellate court said, that makes sense. And finally, there was such an uproar that the country of Germany adopted the IHRA definition, because attacking Jewish people because of a real or perceived connection to the Jewish state is anti-Semitic. Unfortunately, I don't have to tell the story about Germany anymore because it's happening here on a regular basis. And I'll tell you one last story to now. Last spring, Saddam Massoud was on trial, federal trial in New York. On 3 separate occasions, Massoud had violently assaulted 3 different innocent, visibly Jewish men, one of whom was sent to the hospital. In court, Massoud's attorney actually had the audacity to argue that he didn't target these innocent American Jewish people because he's an anti-Semite, but rather, and again I'm going to quote here, to promote social and political goals. Okay? They admitted he should not have used violence, but claimed he did so not because he's an anti-Semite, but because he cares so deeply about the Palestinian conflict and just lost himself in a moment. Now, incredibly, because there's no federal definition of anti-Semitism, that might have worked like it did in Germany. Thankfully, in this case, the prosecutors actually had his texts. There's actually a signal communication where he said to his friends in advance, remember, don't say Jews, say Zionists, right, to preserve the very argument that his lawyers were going to make. Actually, Massoud wasn't that bright. He forgot to heed his own warning, and for victim 3, he walked up and said, are you an effing Jew? So, what can you do? You can't help people. But what would have happened if they didn't have his text? Right? This is actually the federal definition of anti-Semitism could be a matter of life and death. It's a very simple equation. If you would attack a Chinese American because you hate China, that's readily understood as an act of racist or national origin-based discrimination. You should not be able to argue that attacking an innocent Jewish person because you don't like the Jewish state is somehow political and not anti-Semitic. And I will end by just saying this. I'll quote from Ahmed Shahid, who is the former UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion and belief in a recent Human Rights Council report where he suggested, openly recommended, adopting the IHRA definition. He said, anti-Semitism, if left unchecked by governments, poses risks not only to Jews, but also to members of other minority communities. Anti-Semitism is toxic to democracy and mutual respect of citizens, and it threatens all societies in which it goes unchallenged. So we're asking everyone here to please help us challenge it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Now we'll hear from Carly, who's going to give us a deeper dive into what's actually happening in schools, K through 12, and university campuses.
Thank you. Now that we have, hopefully, a fair understanding of some of the background, and specifically the IHRA definition, as Alyza said, my charge here today is to help give you really a snapshot, a picture in a little more detail of what individual Jewish citizens are experiencing across the country at this time. I'll focus mostly on campus situations just because they are so prevalent right now, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is in a little more detail. But I'm going to share stories with you that involve students as young as 11 years old. And they're harrowing, the things that are happening to students on campus. My intent is not to be sensationalist. My intent is to give you a real picture of what real human beings are experiencing because of the things that Mark just talked about. So hopefully I'll succeed in that. So I'll start with a couple of examples on the campus level. As Mark said, what we're seeing on college campuses right now really is, it's an offshoot. It's the same story of what Hamas has done in Israel, right? But it's been taken up, that charge has been taken up by factions on college campuses. Again, because if you know anything about here in the United States, the free speech clause and how ardently we protect free speech rights, right? We're told by the United States Supreme Court that the university is uniquely the marketplace of ideas, right? And so what ends up happening is that all ideas need to be heard, and we have to protect that, and we have to let people say whatever it is they want to say. The thing that gets lost is that there are limits, right? None of our constitutional rights are absolute. And even to the extent, as Mark said, that speech may be protected, there are lines that even speech can cross and turn into harassment, right, that is unlawful. And that's what we're seeing on a broad scale basis. So you probably heard about community rallies in various cities, right, that are supporting Hamas and its atrocities. That same thing is happening on college campuses across the country, and it is an organized movement, right? This is not a pop-up here and a pop-up there. This is an organized movement to maintain the view that has been the predominant narrative on college campuses for decades now, right? And to do it in a way that continues to support the notion that this is merely political, right? That this is merely about disagreement with Israel, right? The veil, however, is now off. And the stories I'm going to tell you are, like I said, they're maybe difficult to hear if you put yourself in the position of the people who are experiencing them. But the veil being off is actually an opportunity to do the things that Mark talked about, that Eric will talk about, to do some of the things that are necessary right now. Because, and I'll go back to the Hamas situation, there is no confusion, or should be no confusion, for anyone, right, with any sort of a moral compass and frankly a brain. When a Hamas terrorist picks up the cell phone of a woman whom he has just brutally murdered and calls home to Gaza and brags about his atrocities and that he has killed 10 not Israelis, those are not his words. Not, Mom, Dad, I killed 10 Israelis. Your son, just killed 10 Jews. There should be no confusion about the purpose of Hamas. So when groups on college campuses and individuals on college campuses are spewing the same kind of vitriol, but supporting Hamas, right? And somehow even attempting to blame Israel for the atrocities. Right? There should be no confusion that this is not about politics. Right? This is about humanity. This is truly a humanitarian crisis. We cannot mince words anymore. We cannot be in a position where we say, oh, well, this is just political, and so anything goes on the college campus because it's freedom of, this is freedom of speech territory, right? So, and again, these examples will make that clear. At Stanford, a lecturer asked the students in his class, and these were first-year students. Okay, so again, imagine these students just got out of high school, right? Some of them may be away from home for the first time, and asked the class of students who in the class was Jewish or Israeli. Again, not strictly Israeli, Jewish or Israeli. And when some of the students identified themselves as such, they were told to gather their belongings and go to the back of the classroom. So we're now segregating the Jews and the Israelis with their belongings from the rest of the class. And the point that this lecturer was ostensibly trying to make was his view that this is what Israel has done to the Palestinians. But again, first of all, I'm not at all claiming that it would have been okay if he had just singled out the Israelis. But it's important that he didn't just say Israelis. It's important that he said Israelis and Jews, right? There can be no confusion. That's anti-Semitism. Thankfully, that lecturer has been suspended pending investigation. Hopefully, will not be in a position to be around and attempting to educate students. At UC Davis, a professor, I can't recall, I believe it's an associate professor, took to social media, which is a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the type of incidents that are coming out of college campuses. A lot of it is the rallies and the things that are happening on campus, but then there's also quite a bit of social media activity. So this associate professor took to social media and said, essentially, one group of people that we have ready access to in this country are the Zionists. You heard the code word, right? Don't say Jews, say Zionists. The Zionist journalists, right, who are spreading misinformation and propaganda. They might be afraid of their bosses, but they should be afraid of us. Emojis following it were a knife, a hatchet, and 3 drops of blood. This is an associate professor who has access to Jewish and Israeli students and other community members on a regular basis. And this is this individual's position. I don't think that there can be any confusion about what the emojis were inciting. Again, can you imagine being a student, a Jewish or Israeli student on a college campus, on that college campus? What if you had that person as your professor? And you know that this person wants you dead. Why? I mean, Mark talked about this idea of individual Jews versus collective Jews. There is no difference. When that's the mentality, you can't say, oh, well, I know this professor, right? I'm a Jewish student and I'm in her class, but I know her, she knows me, and it's okay. There was no distinction made, right? That's not a luxury that students have, is saying, oh, well, I'm different somehow. The chants from the student groups on college campuses as they march through the campus, right? And mostly this is the group Students for Justice in Palestine. There are others that have joined them. And I think it's important to understand that, again, this movement, the Students for Justice in Palestine, is not an individualized, decentralized. It's a very consistent, uniform organization. It has a national entity that really directs a lot of the activities. And there was a toolkit that the National Students for Justice in Palestine organization put out to its student chapters to help them understand the context in which they should be holding these demonstrations and these rallies. And it gave them talking points, and many of our organizations do that. The fact that they put out a toolkit for a demonstration is not a problem. It's the contents of that toolkit that are problematic, and the reality that it is being used and being carried out on campuses across the country. The idea of National Students for Justice in Palestine and the message is that resistance, right, is what's happening. Okay? So it's so-called resistance. When you call for murder, that's not resistance. Certainly not justified resistance, not in this country, not in most countries, not on college campuses. But they call it resistance, and they say that it is justified by any means necessary. But then they go on, and they tell these students that they shouldn't just consider themselves supporters of the cause, but that they are part of it, and that they should be promoting resistance by any means necessary. So they walk through campuses and they chant things like, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." If you've heard that chant before, I'm curious, has anybody heard that before? Okay. Of those who have heard it, how many of you think that have thought that's a political statement? Well, it's encouraging that there were fewer hands the second time around. I want to dispel any notion that that's a political statement. What river and what sea? Right? Jordan River, Mediterranean Sea. What land is between those two? That's the state of Israel. If Palestine will be free, meaning free of what? The answer, and Eric's going to talk about this a little bit more, but the answer is actually found in the Hamas Charter. The answer is free of Jews. And where are they supposed to go? Because the real idea is not, oh, well, let's find them a nice home somewhere else. Right? We saw on October 7th where they're supposed to go and how they're supposed to go there, according to that mentality. Right? So students are walking through, marching, chanting, things like this on college campuses. And when they see other students who are clearly not Israeli, but Jewish, wearing a kippah, maybe also identified, Mark talked about the national origin aspect of Jewish identity, right? And so the support for and connection to the Jewish state. So maybe they're holding an Israeli flag. And these students are being assaulted, physically assaulted and beaten for being visibly Jewish, right? In the midst of these types of events. Perhaps one of the most egregious ones happened in Manhattan just a few days ago, where students were hosting and participating in one of these demonstrations, and it made it to a building which is essentially the library on campus. Right? There's other things going on in there, but it's the library. And there was a group of Jewish students who were in the building, and they ended up having to barricade themselves in a room and lock themselves in to protect themselves from these demonstrators who were chanting these things and literally banging on doors and windows of the room where the Jewish students were. This all might sound a little fantastic. It all might sound like, okay, well, that's an isolated incident. These are not isolated incidents, right? I'm giving you the most egregious ones. But here's the really big problem. And it's the reason that so much of this is necessary, and it's necessary right now. Administrators on college campuses are struggling to recognize that this is anti-Semitism, right? Many of them have struggled to speak out at all, right? We thankfully have some leaders on campuses who did recognize and recognized immediately the need to speak out, to condemn Hamas unequivocally, to recognize that this is murder, this is terrorism, this is not about politics. But there are far too many who have remained silent or who have equivocated and attempted to draw some sort of moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, and so somehow that makes it okay, what's happening on college campuses. And we have to give our students the space to engage in this hateful rhetoric, and we're not really sure that we can protect the Jewish students on campus. There are campuses that have gone to Zoom classes as a result of this. I mean, these are college administrators who are abdicating. They're basically handing their campuses over to students who are rallying in support of terror. They don't know what to do, right? So it's a bigger issue maybe than the definition, but it has to start with a consistent definition so that these policymakers and these authority figures know when they see these things. They have, as Mark said, a guideline to say, okay, you know what, in context, this isn't about politics, because here's the reality. If you're calling for the death of Jews, right, and even doing it in the name of death to Israel, right, it's not a political position of, I want things to be better in Israel, right? That's a position of, I want it destroyed, right? I mean, do you see the difference between, oh, my political position here is about improving policies. I just have disagreement with policies and practices, right? But my chants are about destruction, right? The two don't go together. If you're trying to improve something, you can't at the same time be trying to destroy it, right? And then more importantly, all of this is an attempt to mask, as you're hearing, not just political views against Israel, but in fact, discrimination against Jews, right? So I hope that some of those things help make it clear what's happening on college campuses. As I said, and I don't want to move on quite yet, I forgot. I do want to say that one of the other big issues that we're seeing, like I said, is some of these statements from professors. Some of these professors are actually joining in the rallies. They're joining in these demonstrations. They're giving extra credit to students to go to these rallies, to be educated about these things. They truly believe, and I've seen the documentation, they truly believe that these issues, and by issues, I mean the things that are being chanted, the terrorism rants, right? These issues touch every area, every discipline of intellectual inquiry. So the goal is to take over the college campus with this message. And so these professors are joining in, they're reveling in what happened, because they're claiming that, again, this is resistance. This is the beginning of resistance. I won't go into any further detail than Ken did earlier, but you heard the basic descriptions of what happened on October 7th, right? All I'll say is rape is not resistance. I think that's pretty clear, right? And there were so many worse things. And so for professors, leaders on college campuses to be chanting alongside these students and supporting this kind of atrocity, it's unacceptable. And administrators who don't have the wherewithal to recognize the identity-based attacks against Jews that are a direct result of that, they need this guidance. But like I said, this isn't just happening on college campuses. This is happening in the K through 12 space as well. High school level is predominantly in the form of things like walkouts, sit-ins, same kinds of chants, but it's led in numerous cases to physical assault of Jewish students. The last story I want to tell you, and I know time is getting short, so I will finish with this one. As I said, this is happening at the middle school level as well. I'm going to say I'm very thankful that I personally haven't heard of an elementary school situation yet. I can't say for sure that it hasn't happened, but 11-year-olds. In California, an 11-year-old student went to school just days after the October 7th massacre and sought out, again, not Israeli peers she knew to be Jewish. Told them that the massacre was beautiful. Understand, at 11 years old, these are children who have family and friends in Israel, right? There's not a single Jewish person in this country who's not been impacted by what happened on October 7th. And these kids are directly impacted, and they've got a student walking up to them as they're still trying to process what little probably their parents have shared with them. And the student tells them that this massacre was beautiful and that all Jews and Israelis should be killed. This was reported to the administration, who undertook an investigation, and I believe there were over a dozen between the students and the witnesses who heard this. And the conclusion of the administration was, well, we concluded that this wasn't hate-based, this was a political incident. And so we are implementing the measures that we apply to political incidents. At one point, again, the information that I have, is that the explanation of one of the administrators was, well, we're not really sure that that the student said Jews, even though multiple student witnesses testified to that effect. Well, it's not really clear, and again, we're talking about something that happened in Israel, right? So it's not really clear that she said Jews. As though, and somehow this was lost on the administrator, I suppose, as though it would have been purely political and not hateful at all to wish for the death of all Israelis, as long as you didn't say Jews. Problem is, she did say both. This is an ongoing situation. We're still trying to help these families to make sure that the right measures are implemented. Discipline, obviously, is within the jurisdiction of the school, and we don't have a whole lot of opportunity to speak to those specifics. But we do have an opportunity to speak to safety, right, and to advise schools about what they can do to make sure that their students are safe. And that begins, again, with having an understanding, an accurate understanding of what contemporary anti-Semitism looks like, of the connection between Jewish identity and the ancestral homeland of Israel. And the definition that provides that is the IHRA definition, and it is why it is so critical. I know that you will, any of you who actually go back and take and have the time to look into this further, you'll see arguments against the definition. I want to tell you that they are without merit, that there is absolutely nothing in this definition that runs afoul of First Amendment rights. Right? We're talking about a definition, talking about a tool that helps to identify. And it is the absolute essential first step in being able to see these incidents and immediately say, yep, that's not just political, that's anti-Semitism, that's an attack against Jewish identity, and then we can address it appropriately. So thank you guys for listening, thank you for being here. I'll let Eric come on.
Thank you, Carly. And now we'll have Eric, who will pull it all together for us.
Thank you. I'm like a lot of people who could say that in my case, my wife has 3 first cousins who live in Tel Aviv. And were this from the river to the sea policy ever enacted, that's where her cousins would be, in the Mediterranean Sea. So, I think that realization brings it home. I would also say that if someone tries to call out your individual identity in a group setting, that's usually something pretty sinister, but this is what we're up against, particularly Jewish students. We have known for quite some time that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism, that the hatred of Israel is merely the hatred of Jews in a different guise. The Hamas terrorist organization has made this clear for those who have been confused about it. Article 7 of the Hamas Charter states, "The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight Jews and kill them. Then the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, 'O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him.'" And the barbaric Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th resulted in 1,400 deaths, the largest single-day killing of Jews since the Holocaust. Such a moment in history is a time for moral clarity, a time for understanding that, sorry for the explicit language again, the decapitation of babies, sexual assault, and mass murder and hostage-taking, and defilement of human corpses must be condemned without hesitation or dissent by the international community. But in lieu of moral clarity, we have instead witnessed the moral obtuseness that prevails on many university campuses in this country today. 31 Harvard student groups posted a statement blaming Israel for the violence committed by Hamas. At a pro-Palestinian event at the University of North Carolina, an Israeli professor was pushed down the stairs. At Cooper Union, as Carly referenced, pro-Hamas demonstrators pounded on the locked door of the campus library when they learned there were Jewish students inside. The Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, which is a very sinister operator, and other radical groups at Georgetown, George Washington, and the University of Washington held vigils for terrorists. Not for the victims, for the terrorists. And the UC Berkeley Bears for Palestine released a statement that echoes Hamas's liturgy of incitement. It read in part, "Glory to Palestine, glory to the resistance, and glory to our martyrs." These are only examples of what has happened in higher education over the past 3 weeks. But university administrators have responded in many cases with silence or tepid denunciations of violence while failing to identify Hamas as the culprit. The collective show of timidity by academia has emboldened anti-Israel campus activists, some of whom are professors, and left Jewish students feeling more fearful than ever for their safety. In some ways, this is a predictable continuation of a disturbing trend occurring in public school and university education. The adoption by schools of critical ethnic studies curricula that negatively portray Jews in Israel, with the latter being vilified as a colonial occupier and apartheid state. This is an issue that continues to loom over college and high school curricula, even as Jewish students in those schools remain vulnerable to harassment and attacks because of anti-Zionist ideologies. The backdrop to all of this is an unprecedented confluence of events we're witnessing in the Jewish world today. It's not that the manifestations of anti-Semitism we're experiencing in 2023 are entirely new to us. In some ways, they're eerily familiar, but rarely have we seen them occur simultaneously with such intensity. Whether it's on the far right, the far left, among radical Islamists, or online, whether it's in Europe, or in the United States, or elsewhere, anti-Semitism is at its greatest peak since World War II. One of the greatest challenges in the fight against anti-Semitism over the past 2 decades has been the effort to define the problem. This underscores the importance of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA adoption of a working definition of anti-Semitism, which Mark and Carly spoken about. But just to be clear, the IHRA working definition is predicated on the simple notion that, quote, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred of Jews. Now, the IHRA definition contains many contemporary examples of what anti-Semitism looks like, such as the demonization and delegitimization of Israel, Holocaust denial and distortion, accusations of dual loyalty, and conspiracy theories implicating Jews. To date, more than 30 countries have adopted it. The White House this year announced a national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, featuring a comprehensive approach, including measures to raise awareness of the problem, increase security of Jewish institutions and individuals, and reverse the normalization of anti-Semitic attitudes. The mostly admirable White House plan endorsed the IHRA working definition, but unfortunately indicated it, quote, welcomes and appreciates the Nexus Task Force definition of anti-Semitism. This is an academic proposal that greatly undermines the IHRA definition by opting not to condemn anti-Zionism. This despite the fact that much of today's anti-Semitism consists of anti-Zionism in the form of virulent hatred of Israel, as opposed to the routine policy criticism that the IHRA definition explicitly states is not anti-Semitism. And so, for the Cornell professor who declared at a rally that he was, quote, exhilarated by the Hamas attack, prompting chants from the crowd of, there's that phrase again, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Or for the Columbia professor, this is my alma mater, who said the Hamas attack was awesome. For people like this, these are professors at Ivy League universities, challenging Israel's right to exist is nothing to worry about. So we've seen, just from recent examples alone, how wrong the nexus definition is to not condemn anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. The White House in 2019, this was the previous administration, issued an executive order incorporating the IHRA definition and establishing the principle that Jews enjoy the same protections as other minorities under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. The current administration has extended that principle to 10 federal agencies. But what is still needed is for the administration to issue a regulation codifying the principles contained in the 2019 executive order. The administration has promised and delayed such a regulation twice so far. Never has the need for such an action been greater, with terrorism abroad fanning the flames of anti-Semitism here at home, particularly on university campuses that have shown themselves to be laboratories for extremism. We need Congress to act in favor of a regulation on anti-Semitism by sending a letter to the Secretary of Education underscoring the urgency of this moment. We further need Congress to vocally support Israel's right, its obligation to defend itself against terrorists whose mission is to eradicate the Jewish state. We need the U.S. to provide additional funding for the crucial Iron Dome missile defense program, which saves the lives of Israeli civilians, and for the nonprofit security grant program, which protects Jewish and other minority communities at risk of attack. And we need the Senate to adopt the bipartisan Blackburn-Rosen resolution on anti-Semitism in higher education. And we need Congress to adopt the anti-Semitism awareness bill that Ken referenced earlier. The state of Israel and the American Jewish community face severe, even existential threats, and we call on the U.S. Congress to rise to the occasion with the kind of moral clarity that this moment demands of us. Thank you.
I know we've run a little late. We maybe have time for one or two quick questions, if there are any questions. If not.
Just a quick clarifying question. Could you repeat what the IHRA stands for?
The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA. IHRA, it's their working definition of anti-Semitism. It was issued in 2016. There is, and I will tell you, it's you can go online and you can Google the State Department definition of anti-Semitism, and you'll see that the State Department actually came out in 2010. They adopted their own definition. This is before the IHRA definition existed. It was based on an earlier version, but that they were working towards. But what's nice if you go back to that 2010 definition is you will see that the what I'll call the black box letter definition is identical to the IHRA definition. And then the contemporary examples that you have in IHRA are all there in the 2010 definition. The main difference is that the 2010 definition has a heading that says anti-Semitism relative to Israel. And it pulls out the examples that are specific to what is anti-Semitism. In other words, when does the criticism of Israel cross the line into anti-Semitism? And it divides those examples into three categories, what are called the 3Ds. When the criticism demonizes, delegitimizes, or applies a double standard to Israel. And then you'll see each of the examples under those headings. If you go back and then compare that to the IHRA definition, it will help you understand the contemporary examples that are listed in the IHRA definition, because then you'll be able to realize, oh, this is what they mean when they talk about the examples relative to Israel.
First, I want to thank y'all for talking. I'm actually in high school, I'm a high school intern, and anti-Semitism in the K-12 world is definitely prevalent. I dealt with it myself, I've seen others deal with it, which is part of the reason I lead a Jewish organization at my school, whose main focus is not only promoting Jewish values, but combating anti-Semitism directly. But I guess I have one question, maybe this is more for the Rebbe's in our attendance, but there seems to be something that I've been considering is, there seems to be an inability to recognize whether Palestinian lives that have been lost as well as Israeli lives. It's estimated by The Hill just the other day that only 34% of Palestinians actually support Hamas. So I guess my question is just remaining true to being Jewish and remaining true to being in support of the dream of Israel and the dream of a safe Jewish sanctuary. How can we also recognize Palestinian lives that have been lost?
We
have two rabbis.
Yeah, okay. We do recognize that Palestinian lives have been lost, and we mourn the loss of innocent lives. But I think in discussing this issue, it's important to understand the dynamics at work. Israel has, over the years, exercised unbelievable restraint in defending itself with a view toward minimizing collateral damage, minimizing the loss of innocent lives. However, they are engaged in a struggle against an enemy, a terrorist organization that does not value human life. They don't just devalue Israeli lives and Jewish lives, they devalue the Palestinian lives. And so it is typical behavior of Hamas. We're seeing this right now. They fire rockets at Israel from, for example, hospitals and schools. And then they load those buildings up with civilians, children, elderly people, women. And when Israel fires back at the places where the rockets are launched, they try to clear. They warn people that they're going to be directed, that these buildings are targets. And Hamas forbids anyone from leaving the building, so as to maximize the loss of innocent life. So, and they're using human shields. I don't think that people recognize this when they talk about this sort of false symmetry between the two sides. Well, Hamas killed this many Israelis, Israeli killed this many Palestinians. Let's just call a ceasefire and stop the bloodshed. It doesn't work. It doesn't capture what's really happening. So, no one should ever celebrate the loss of human lives. Jews do not. Palestinians do. And that's the difference.
I just want to, three very, very quick points. Number one, every single innocent human life lost is a tragedy, an absolute and unforgivable tragedy, period. Number two, every innocent life lost in this conflict is the fault of Hamas. Jews and Israelis can hold in their heart two things in dialectic tension. It is tragic that lives are being lost. But that does not mean that it's unlawful, and it does not mean that it is not necessary to prevent the innocent loss of more life. Under the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, Israel doesn't just have a right to defend itself, it has a duty on behalf of the entire world to make sure that never again really means never again. And it's really important to note two more quick things. Number one, if you believe that to support Palestinian rights you have to support terror, you don't support Palestinian rights, you support terror. Number two, this is a critical moment for the Palestinian people as well. Over the last 100 years, even pre-state, the Jewish community and then the state of Israel has offered peace plans over 33 times. Some of them have been committed to writings and treaties. I ask all of you, if you haven't yet, read Dennis Ross's book on the 2000 Clinton peace parameters. It was the absolute best deal that anyone could have asked for, and the Palestinians walked away. Okay? It is impossible to make peace with people who don't want to. This might be a chance for the real leadership to be displayed in the Palestinian society, because you're 100% right. Every life lost is tragic, and the only way to stop doing it is to acknowledge that Israel does have a right to exist, and it's not going to be from the river to the sea, Judenrein, or free of Jews.
I'm not a rabbi. And what I'm about to say is not meant to sound trite or to minimize in any way, so don't, I hope you don't hear it that way. You're exactly right to have the concerns that you have, right? And as my colleagues here have said, that every life lost matters. And the issue is about freeing Palestine. But it's not from the river to the sea. It's freeing Palestine from Hamas. That's the message.
Okay. Well, I thank you all for coming. We really appreciate your attendance. And if you have any further questions, I'm sure there are cards and information about the organization outside, and feel free to always reach out to us as a resource. And we'll let you know when the next one of our programs is coming about. Thank you.